The fluorescent lights flickered faintly above the ER entrance, their hum blending with the soft beeping of monitors. Outside, the night had fallen hard over the city, and inside, the emergency room was already tense. Patients shifted on stretchers, some crying quietly, others barely conscious. Nurses hustled between beds, doctors barked orders, and technicians moved carts loaded with supplies. Amid the chaos, she moved like a shadow. Her name was Emily. Young, quiet, barely noticed by most of the staff. Her uniform was tidy, her movements precise. She checked vitals, recorded notes, adjusted 4 lines, always a step ahead, but no one seemed to look. A doctor glanced briefly, muttered something about her being new, and walked past without another word. A patient coughed violently, splattering the side rail with blood. The staff recoiled slightly. Emily moved forward, steady hands, calm voice, "It's okay, I've got this." She repositioned the patient, stabilized the airway, and pressed a gauze just right. The monitors flatlined for a second before beeping normally again. The attending nurse, younger and louder, glanced at her but said nothing, shaking their head as if dismissing her action. A tray of instruments was knocked over in the commotion. Everyone stopped, scrambling to pick up syringes and clamps. Emily simply bent down, retrieved each item in an almost imperceptible motion, lined them up correctly, and continued with her checks. The room's rhythm subtly corrected itself around her, unnoticed by all but a few observant eyes. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. A janitor, hurried and anxious, ran past, bumping a stretcher. Emily steadied it without glancing up, murmuring instructions so soft they were almost inaudible, yet precise enough that the stretcher didn't tip. She walked on, her calmness a stark contrast to the rising tension around her. Outside the trauma bay, 2 paramedics wheeled in a middle-aged man, his breathing shallow, a gash on his temple. Doctors shouted over the commotion. Emily stepped to the side, watching. She didn't interject, didn't argue. She observed the position of the 4, the angle of the head, the way the monitors were set. A subtle adjustment here, a quiet instruction there. The patient's vitals stabilized enough for the doctors to proceed. They nodded to each other, oblivious to the invisible hand guiding the process. The overhead lights buzzed, a distant siren wailed. A sense of unease settled over the ER. Something was off tonight. Emily felt it too, though she didn't show it. Her eyes flicked toward the entrance doors again. The room's chaos continued, unaware of how close they might be to something far worse. And through it all, she moved with quiet competence, her presence unnoticed, yet everything she touched ran smoother. The staff ignored her. They assumed she was just a young nurse, inexperienced, easily overlooked. They didn't yet realize how wrong they were. Quiet hands. Precise movements. Calm in the storm. That was Emily. The ghost in the ER. The night deepened, and the ER hummed with routine yet growing tension. Emily moved from bed to bed, quietly observing patients and staff. Something was off, small details that didn't fit the usual pattern. A nurse muttered under her breath about missing equipment. A doctor glanced anxiously at a patient chart, then walked away. Subtle inconsistencies, a gap in the records, a stretcher left near a fire exit, a whispered radio alert from a security guard, nagged at her attention. Emily paused beside a young man with a fractured arm. As she adjusted his splint, she noticed a security ID swiping twice on a door scanner outside the ward. She followed the pattern with her eyes, noting a second shadowy figure hovering in the hallway. No one else seemed to notice, the staff were absorbed in routine tasks, tired from endless shifts. The monitor's steady beeping masked something more dangerous. She heard it faintly, footsteps running lightly, but controlled, almost too quiet to be human. A paramedic nearly bumped into her, rushing past with a gurney, but she raised a hand and silently guided him aside. He barely registered it. She moved to the trauma bay. A patient on the stretcher was restless, thrashing despite pain medication. Emily repositioned him, carefully aligning the oxygen mask and monitoring his vitals. Without raising her voice, she coordinated the attending nurse to adjust the infusion rate, saving critical minutes. The nurse, flustered and exhausted, followed her direction mechanically. Only Emily remained calm. Outside the ER doors, a commotion rose faintly. Emily's gaze sharpened. The overhead lights flickered again, casting elongated shadows across the corridor. A faint metallic clang echoed, too precise, too deliberate. Emily's instincts, honed from long training she never spoke of, recognized patterns, movement, timing, repetition. Something was coming, something beyond the ordinary emergencies. She didn't alarm anyone. No sudden gestures, no warnings. She simply prepared, repositioning patients, checking locks on critical supply rooms, aligning stretchers to allow quick evacuation if needed. Each motion was deliberate, efficient, unnoticed by those around her. Then, a whispered alert from the radio: possible breach, north entrance. Most staff froze, exchanging confused looks. Emily didn't flinch. Her mind mapped the ER, the exits, the patient's conditions. In silence, she calculated, organized, and began adjusting priorities. Every small detail mattered: routes, monitors, oxygen lines, stretchers, fragile patients. A doctor muttered, "Something's wrong." Emily simply nodded, her eyes scanning the room. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. She just acted. By the time the staff began to feel the unease, Emily had already anticipated the first moves of the unknown threat. Calm, quiet, precise, she was ready. The ER's routine was fragile, but she held it together, a silent anchor in the gathering storm. No one yet knew she was capable of far more than tending wounds. No one realized that the chaos on the horizon would test every skill she had, skills trained for situations far beyond a hospital night shift. And as the sirens outside grew louder, Emily adjusted her posture, her hands still steady, her mind already moving through the next steps. The ER would need her, but they didn't yet know it. Quiet observation. Subtle preparation. Invisible authority. Emily was ready for the storm they couldn't yet see. The distant wail of sirens grew sharper, echoing through the concrete corridors of the hospital. The ER staff were already tense, fatigued from the night's relentless flow of patients, but now unease tightened their movements. Footsteps echoed unnaturally, hard, precise, purposeful, outside the double doors of the main entrance. Emily's gaze flicked toward them, calm, scanning, calculating. A sudden commotion erupted as two paramedics rushed in, pushing a stretcher with a young woman, her face pale and trembling. "Multiple injuries," one shouted, panic edging his voice. "Assault, downtown." Other staff froze, their hands hovering over equipment, unsure where to start. The monitors in the ER beeped faster, alarms triggered by sudden drops in vitals. Emily stepped between them and the nearest patient, gently guiding the paramedics to the trauma bay. "Tray here," she said, pointing without a glance at the others. Her voice was soft but unyielding. The staff complied automatically, as if following some silent protocol only she could articulate. Down the corridor, a door slammed, rattling the lights overhead. A group of bystanders in hospital attire crowded near the nurse's station, unsure whether to help or flee. A nurse tripped over a cord, barely catching herself, and muttered an apology. Emily adjusted the cord without speaking, preventing a potential hazard. Her eyes flicked back to the entrance, noting movements, timing, and alignment. The chaos was building, but she moved through it with quiet authority. Then came the first unmistakable sign, a gunshot outside, muffled but sharp. Panic rippled through the ER. Patients screamed, stretchers rattled, monitors shrieked. Doctors shouted instructions that barely registered with anyone. Emily didn't shout. She didn't flinch. She stepped forward, placing herself between a frightened nurse and a panicking patient. "Keep him still," she murmured to the nurse, adjusting the patient's oxygen mask and immobilizing the neck brace with hands that betrayed no hesitation. Staff glanced at her, astonished by her composure, but said nothing. The tension in the air was palpable, yet Emily's calm acted as a counterweight, anchoring the room. Another gunshot. Louder. Closer. Staff began to look for exits, abandoning patients in their haste. Emily raised her hand slightly, subtle, almost imperceptible, signaling them to hold positions. A few of the older nurses obeyed automatically, sensing the authority in her posture even if they couldn't explain it. The monitors started to flash erratically, alerts of dropped vitals, equipment malfunctions. Emily moved from bed to bed, prioritizing silently. One patient was stable, another teetering on the edge. She switched 4 lines, adjusted oxygen, checked vitals, her motions deliberate, exact, efficient. No wasted energy. Each small correction prevented further catastrophe. A crash echoed from the hall, glass breaking, a stretcher tipped over. Staff jumped back, startled. Emily calmly guided them to stabilize it, directing without words, almost as if choreographing an invisible dance. The ER began to bend around her competence, even though the staff weren't consciously aware of it. Outside, shadows moved near the main doors. Emily's eyes tracked each figure, subtle shifts in posture, rhythm, and movement. She sensed the escalating threat before anyone else could comprehend it. Her hands never paused, her voice remained calm, and yet every motion hinted at a deeper capability, an unspoken mastery of crisis management far beyond normal nursing. One doctor finally looked at her, voice trembling. "How are you, Dash?" Emily didn't answer. She simply continued, silently directing care, preparing for what was coming next. The ER had become a battlefield of tension and fear, but in the center of it, Emily remained a still point. She didn't yet reveal her full authority, but the first cracks in others' assumptions were forming. Those who had dismissed her as just another young nurse began to sense, without knowing how, that the calm, quiet figure moving through the chaos held the room together. And outside the ER doors, the first real wave of danger was arriving. Quiet decisiveness. Subtle command. The storm had begun, and Emily was already several steps ahead. The double doors of the ER burst open, slamming against the walls. The sudden rush of cold air carried tension, adrenaline, and a faint metallic scent. A team of uniformed SWAT officers stormed in, weapons drawn, eyes scanning every corner. They moved like shadows, silent but deliberate, and immediately the staff froze, panic spreading like a contagion. Emily didn't flinch. Her eyes swept the room, cataloging patients, exits, equipment, and personnel. She didn't raise her voice, didn't call for attention. Instead, she moved with measured steps toward the trauma bay where a critically injured patient lay. One hand adjusted the oxygen mask, the other checked the 4. Her calmness was magnetic, drawing a few wary glances from the nearest officers. A SWAT team leader approached, frowning. "We've got a hostile inside, where's the main threat?" He scanned the room, tension coiled in his stance. The ER staff murmured nervously, offering fragmented reports. Emily stepped forward slightly, tilting her head toward the corridor. "Prioritize the patients closest to the entrance," she said softly, pointing to the stretchers without a word of argument or explanation. The team leader's eyes flicked toward her. Something in her tone, the absolute confidence and precision of her gestures, gave him pause. He nodded almost imperceptibly. The rest of the team moved to follow her silent lead. A nurse near the pediatric bay panicked. "We need to move them, now." Emily's hand rose gently but firmly, cutting through the panic. She positioned the child and caregivers in a safer section, guiding them with minimal motion, no fuss, just precise placement. The officers adjusted around her, executing her direction almost instinctively, though she had no formal command over them. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, rapid, controlled, and deliberate. A gunshot rang out from a distant corridor. The room flinched, patients cried out, monitors screamed. Emily moved to the center, using her body to shield a young patient from the nearest officer's line of sight. She didn't shout orders. She gave subtle gestures, adjusting stances, moving hands toward equipment, nodding slightly. The SWAT officers immediately understood, reacting as if her presence carried authority they couldn't yet define. One officer whispered, "Who is she?" The team leader only shook his head, eyes still scanning for the threat. Emily's movements were calm, quiet, deliberate, but every motion was commanding. She stabilized a critical patient, secured the 4 lines, adjusted monitors, and shifted stretchers to clear pathways, all without speaking more than a few soft words. A second gunshot closer now. Staff screamed, some diving behind equipment. Emily stood, unflinching, scanning the ER like a strategist on a battlefield. She silently directed the nearest officers, 2 to cover the north exit, another to secure the supply room, all while keeping patient care uninterrupted. Her ability to multitask, anticipate, and coordinate was undeniable, though unspoken. The SWAT team leader finally nodded to his officers, a silent admission of trust. The ER staff, still in shock, began to follow her subtle cues. Hands moved, stretchers shifted, monitors were adjusted, hallways cleared, all with a quiet rhythm dictated entirely by Emily. Outside the main doors, movement grew frenetic. Emily's eyes flicked to the security cameras mounted along the corridor. She read the shadows, predicting paths and bottlenecks. With small, deliberate motions, she directed SWAT to intercept the intruder, while simultaneously guiding staff to protect patients. The first confrontation was brief but intense. A lone intruder appeared at the far end of the corridor, partially hidden. SWAT positioned themselves, but it was Emily's subtle cues, the tilt of her hand, a quiet nod, the positioning of a stretcher, that allowed the officers to block and contain the threat without escalating further. Staff stared, finally realizing something impossible. The young nurse they had ignored, the one they assumed was inexperienced, was orchestrating the ER's defense with precision and authority. She wasn't shouting or demanding respect. She wasn't even acknowledged yet. But her competence, calm, and quiet authority had already saved lives and prevented chaos from spiraling further. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced at the patients around her, checking each one silently, making sure all vital lines were secure, all movements calculated. Her eyes shifted to the SWAT team leader, who gave her a subtle nod, permission, acknowledgement, trust, all without words. The ER was still in danger, but under her quiet control, the first confrontation ended without catastrophe. And as the officers moved deeper into the hospital, Emily stepped back into the shadows, returning to her work, unnoticed yet unmistakable. The authority reversal had begun. Those who underestimated her could no longer ignore the truth forming in real time. Quiet command. Subtle coordination. Authority earned, not demanded. Emily had survived the first test, and the storm was only beginning. The ER had settled into an uneasy rhythm after the initial chaos, but Emily knew it was temporary. The first confrontation had revealed only a fraction of the threat. Gunshots had stopped, for now, but the tension in the air was heavier than before. Staff moved cautiously, hesitant, looking to each other for guidance that no one had yet fully provided. Emily's eyes scanned every detail, patients' positions, oxygen lines, for drips, monitors flashing with irregular readings. Her mind worked like a precise clock, calculating every variable, predicting potential hazards. She repositioned a stretcher here, adjusted a monitor there, all in subtle, fluid motions. No one questioned her, though some glanced at her curiously, sensing that she knew far more than she revealed. A security guard whispered to a nurse, "We heard movement near the pharmacy." Emily nodded without turning. "Secure patients in Bay 3, she said softly. Her instructions were minimal, but staff responded immediately. A paramedic hesitated near the north corridor, unsure what to do. Emily stepped over, gestured toward a path to safety, and the paramedic followed her guidance without hesitation. Down the main corridor, shadows shifted, too deliberate to be normal. Emily noticed subtle cues, the pattern of footsteps, the pace of movement, the angle of light on the walls. She predicted the intruder's next approach. The staff had no awareness of what was coming, but Emily already had a plan in motion. She moved to the trauma bay where the most critical patients were clustered. One was a middle-aged man with a severe head wound, another a teenager with multiple fractures. Emily assessed their positions in seconds, adjusted IVs, and checked oxygen masks, all while keeping an eye on the corridor. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and perfectly timed. Suddenly, a window rattled, a distant shot ricocheted, too close for comfort. Staff panicked again. Emily raised a hand slightly, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed, and the room stilled. She moved through the ER silently, adjusting positions of stretchers and equipment, ensuring escape routes were clear, and that critical patients were protected. The staff unconsciously followed her lead, each small motion coordinated without explicit orders. The SWAT officers were now deeper in the building, reporting intermittent movement near the stairwell. Emily anticipated their needs. She positioned 2 stretchers to create a safe buffer, moved a portable monitor to cover a blind spot, and aligned oxygen tanks to prevent tripping hazards. Her actions were surgical, each decision weighed, each adjustment exact. One of the staff, younger and uncertain, whispered, "How does she know what to do?" Another shook their head. Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. Words were unnecessary. Her competence spoke louder than any explanation could. From the hallway, a muffled shout. Emily's head turned sharply, eyes narrowing. The intruder was testing the boundaries, moving strategically. She adjusted the positions of 2 more patients, repositioned a monitor, and subtly guided the SWAT team with silent gestures toward the corridor. Officers, trained to follow commands from recognized leaders, instinctively read her signals and adapted their formation. Emily's focus never wavered. Each decision balanced patient safety with tactical advantage. She anticipated potential risks, a panicked patient lunging toward a stretcher, a nurse inadvertently stepping into the line of sight, or a loose cord tripping someone. She neutralized each hazard before it became a problem, all while maintaining her calm. A paramedic whispered urgently, "We need more guidance." Emily didn't speak. She placed her hand on a clipboard, motioned toward the exit routes with a slight tilt of her head, and they understood. Every action was a subtle command, every movement a blueprint for safety. The intruder fired a single shot near the north corridor. Emily reacted instantly, moving a patient and stepping between them and the line of fire, maintaining calm, controlling the chaos. SWAT moved in precise tandem, following her subtle guidance. In that moment, the staff and the officers understood something unspoken. This young nurse, quiet and unassuming, was orchestrating the entire defense of the ER. Her calm authority had shifted the dynamic. She no longer merely supported, she directed, without words or fanfare, without recognition, without ego. As the intruder retreated slightly, Emily ensured every patient was secure, every staff member in a safe position, every equipment line clear. The ER's rhythm had realigned around her. What had been chaos was now a controlled environment, poised to handle the next escalation. The storm outside was building, but inside, the ER had a quiet strategist. Emily's tactical shift had bought precious time, saved lives, and demonstrated a subtle reversal of authority. Those who had underestimated her now unconsciously followed her lead. Her eyes scanned the room once more, the monitor's beeps a steady rhythm against the adrenaline rushing through the hallways. The threat was not over, but the ER was no longer defenseless. Emily's quiet, invisible hand had made all the difference. And though no one yet understood the full extent of her capability, one truth had begun to emerge: this young nurse was far more than anyone had believed. Calculated calm. Subtle command. Tactical mastery. Emily had shifted the battlefield without raising her voice. The ER was tense, but the calm Emily had established was fragile. Outside the ward, footsteps and muffled shouts grew louder, closer, and more erratic. The intruder had not retreated, they were probing, testing weaknesses. Emily's eyes flicked toward the entrance, then back to the patients. Every detail mattered: oxygen lines, monitors, IVs, even the placement of chairs and carts in the hallway. One misstep could be fatal. A sudden commotion, a patient's stretcher toppled as a nurse stumbled. Monitors beeped in alarm. Emily reacted instantly, steadying the stretcher with a quiet hand, repositioning the patient, and checking vitals. The nurse froze, stunned. "It's fine," Emily said softly, moving on. No panic, no wasted motion, just precise, deliberate corrections. The staff were beginning to falter. Some whispered anxiously, others openly debated where to move patients, unsure what to prioritize. Emily scanned the room, making silent calculations. 2 patients required critical attention, a third had an unstable airway, and a fourth was bleeding from a gash on the leg. She approached the first critical patient, a middle-aged man with head trauma, and stabilized the 4-line. Without speaking, she gestured toward another nurse to monitor oxygen levels. Her direction was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet completely clear. The nurse obeyed, following Emily's guidance instinctively. Another alert, a monitor beeped rapidly, indicating dropping blood pressure in a trauma patient. Emily assessed, adjusting medications, confirming vitals, stabilizing the patient. Then, a subtle shift in the hallway caught her eye, shadows moving, pacing differently, more erratic than before. Emily's hands never paused. She repositioned patients, cleared pathways, and subtly guided staff to cover blind spots, all while maintaining situational awareness. A paramedic hesitated near the north corridor. Emily approached silently, adjusted his stance, and gestured toward the nearest safe exit. He nodded and complied immediately. The intruder's presence escalated. Gunshots rang out faintly in the distance, rattling the ER doors and windows. Staff panicked. Patients cried. Alarms screeched. Emily's voice remained low, almost a whisper, directing actions: move him here. Secure the 4. Cover the corridor. Her instructions were few but perfectly timed, perfectly executed. Then came the moral complication. A patient, critically injured, required immediate attention in a corridor exposed to the approaching intruder. Staff hesitated. Emily weighed her options, calculating risk versus necessity. She stepped forward, placing herself between the patient and the line of potential danger. Her hands worked quickly to stabilize the patient while simultaneously signaling SWAT officers down the hall. The intruder fired again, closer this time. Emily didn't flinch. She protected her patient, adjusted oxygen masks, and guided staff into safer positions. Every motion precise, every choice deliberate. The ER had become a chessboard, each patient and staff member a piece carefully maneuvered to avoid casualties. Communication lines were failing, radios crackled with static, unclear instructions, and partial reports. Emily had to compensate, coordinating through gestures, eye contact, and subtle body language. SWAT officers began to trust her cues, following silently as she moved through the chaos, even though she held no formal authority over them. Another complication: a stretcher blocked a key exit. Emily repositioned it silently, moving a nurse and patient in one motion, without drawing attention. Staff followed instinctively, almost automatically. She had created a controlled microenvironment in the center of what was otherwise descending into chaos. Emily's mind never stopped. She anticipated further intrusions, planned safe zones for critical patients, and allocated staff to cover vulnerable points. She absorbed the panic, deflected it, and redistributed it into disciplined action without raising her voice. By the time the intruder made a sudden move toward the trauma bay, Emily had already anticipated it. SWAT officers intercepted efficiently, using her silent signals, while the staff kept critical patients out of harm's way. The first escalation had been managed, but it came at a cost. Emily's hands trembled slightly from the strain, her back ached from constant movement, and her mind buzzed with calculations. Every decision carried weight, every choice a moral consequence. The ER remained intact. Patients were safe, for now. Staff were shaken, yet functioning under her guidance, unaware of the depth of her skill. Emily allowed herself a brief breath, surveying the room. The storm outside had intensified, but inside, she had created a fragile equilibrium. Yet she knew this balance was temporary. The intruder had tested the boundaries. Emily had won small battles, but the real confrontation was coming. The moral tension lingered, risking herself for others, making choices that could cost more than she could afford. Her quiet authority was becoming undeniable, even to those who had doubted her. Staff were beginning to follow her instincts unconsciously. SWAT officers were adapting to her unspoken commands. Emily's competence had shifted the dynamic in the ER, and the intruder would soon face a fully prepared, if understated, force. The room fell silent for a heartbeat. Then a distant thud echoed. The next escalation had arrived. Silent authority. Moral weight. Escalation of threat. Emily's mastery had prevented disaster, but the test was far from over. The ER was tense, almost eerily still between bursts of chaos. Alarms from monitors sounded intermittently, punctuating the low hum of distant sirens outside. Patients' eyes followed the staff nervously, some whimpering softly, others gripping the edges of their beds. Emily moved among them, silent, calm, calculating. Every step, every glance, measured. A sudden shift in the hallway brought the threat closer. A critically injured patient, a young man with severe internal bleeding, lay exposed on a stretcher at the edge of the main corridor. The paramedic attending him froze, uncertainty clouding his eyes. SWAT officers had secured the north wing, but the corridor to the patient was partially exposed. Emily assessed the situation instantly. She could redirect staff to safety, but it would leave the patient vulnerable. She could shield him herself, but that risked drawing attention to herself, risking the very balance she had established. Her mind calculated probabilities, danger zones, and potential outcomes in seconds. The choice was clear, but costly. She stepped forward. Her body became a barrier between the patient and the corridor. One hand stabilized the stretcher, the other checked 4 lines, ensuring oxygen flow and vital support. Every motion was precise, deliberate, and practiced. A gunshot rang out in the distance, closer this time. The ER staff flinched, some ducking instinctively. Emily held her position, eyes scanning the hallway, calculating the intruder's likely path. She shifted slightly, guiding the stretcher just out of reach of the corridor while signaling subtly to SWAT to cover the exposed entrance. The staff nearest her froze. "Move them," one whispered. Emily shook her head gently, barely perceptible. "Not yet," she murmured. Every second counted, a wrong move could cost a life. She maintained calm, her presence both shield and anchor. The young patient's vitals fluctuated. Emily adjusted the 4, checked the oxygen, pressed gently on a wound to control bleeding. Her actions were methodical, yet every decision carried moral weight: stay and protect this patient, or risk exposure by repositioning them for safety. She chose to stay. The intruder appeared briefly in the corridor, a shadow, assessing, testing, probing. Emily's eyes met the faint reflection of the figure in a monitor screen. Her body tensed, ready to react, but not prematurely. She waited, guided by instinct, experience, and training she had never disclosed. A SWAT officer leaned slightly into the corridor. Emily raised a hand subtly, stopping him. The patient was still vulnerable. The officer obeyed immediately, trusting the quiet nurse whose authority had grown invisible yet undeniable. Another shot rang out, ricocheting from the hallway walls. Emily shifted the stretcher slightly, absorbing the impact on her side, keeping herself between patient and danger. Her hands worked with precision, adjusting monitors, stabilizing the patient, silently orchestrating the positioning of staff and equipment. Every action minimized risk, but every second she stayed exposed added danger. She made a snap decision: she would act as the shield. She instructed a nearby nurse to monitor the patient's vitals and adjust the 4 lines if needed. Then, using her body and subtle movements, she guided the patient to a safer alignment within the bay, keeping the corridor partially blocked. The SWAT officers moved into positions that covered potential intruder paths, following her silent cues. The patient stabilized enough for the immediate threat to pass. Emily finally allowed herself a small shift, a moment to breathe, though her posture remained alert. Her body ached from constant tension, her mind raced through contingencies, and her chest tightened with the weight of responsibility. The staff around her were awed silently, noticing the decisiveness, the skill, the moral courage. Yet no one fully understood. Emily had made the choice to risk herself to save a life, without hesitation, without commentary. The cost, physical and emotional, was hers alone. As the corridor cleared momentarily, Emily stepped back, allowing the staff to resume minor tasks, monitoring vitals, adjusting equipment. She did not seek praise or acknowledgement. Her moral choice had been made, the patient was alive, and the ER remained under her control. Her eyes scanned the room. Each patient stabilized, each staff member accounted for. The crisis had escalated, but her quiet authority had prevented catastrophe. The weight of the decision lingered, every moral choice carried a cost, but it was necessary. Emily's silent competence had shifted the ER's balance again. Staff followed her instinctively now. SWAT officers respected her judgment without needing words. Her moral courage, paired with skill, had saved lives, and the staff's assumptions about her were crumbling. And yet, she remained unnoticed in the grand scheme. Her actions spoke volumes, but recognition was neither sought nor given. She would continue to move, to protect, to act, quietly, effectively, at a cost only she would bear. The next phase of confrontation loomed, but Emily's moral choice had established one truth: in the ER, she was the anchor, the strategist, the protector. Quiet, unseen, yet undeniably authoritative. Silent courage. Calculated risk. Moral weight carried in stillness. Emily's choice defined the line between survival and disaster. The tension in the ER had become almost tangible. Every beep of a monitor, every shuffling footstep, every distant siren felt amplified in the charged silence. The intruder was no longer probing, they were moving decisively toward the center of the hospital, toward the patients Emily had spent the night protecting. Emily's eyes swept the room, cataloging positions, vulnerabilities, and escape routes. The SWAT officers had secured the north wing, but the corridor remained partially exposed. Every second counted. Her mind calculated probabilities, contingencies, and optimal responses in real time. A sudden crash, a gurney tipped over in the chaos. Staff froze, momentarily paralyzed. Emily moved immediately, steadying the patient, adjusting IVs, and signaling another nurse to cover a blind spot. Her gestures were subtle, almost imperceptible, but the staff obeyed automatically, synchronized with her presence. The intruder appeared at the far end of the main corridor, partially silhouetted by the emergency exit lights. A firearm glinted in the dim light. SWAT officers raised their weapons, ready, but Emily didn't panic. She moved calmly, positioning herself near the center of the ER, directing both staff and officers with gestures so subtle they could have been mistaken for routine movement. One officer whispered, "She's controlling this." The team leader nodded, eyes fixed on Emily's every motion. Her authority was invisible yet undeniable. Emily assessed the threat. The intruder was armed, unpredictable, and mobile. Patients' lives were at immediate risk. She moved between stretchers, signaling staff to shield the most critical patients, adjusting oxygen lines and 4 drips without breaking eye contact with the corridor. Every motion was deliberate, precise, and restrained. The intruder fired a shot. A cry went up from the staff. Emily's body shifted to shield a patient, hands steady, eyes calm. She gestured subtly to a SWAT officer, who moved in tandem, intercepting the threat without escalating violence further. The intruder hesitated, misjudging the situation as Emily's silent coordination anticipated every action. Another officer called out instructions, but Emily didn't need to respond. Her gaze, her gestures, her movements conveyed more than words ever could. She guided the team to contain the intruder, to protect patients, and to maintain order in the chaos. The intruder made a sudden move toward the trauma bay, trying to reach the most vulnerable patients. Emily acted instantly. She repositioned a stretcher, redirected a nurse, and used her body as a subtle barrier, all while maintaining composure. The intruder was momentarily blocked, disoriented by the coordinated response that seemed to emanate from the quiet nurse no one had yet truly acknowledged. SWAT officers flanked the intruder, guided silently by Emily's precise cues. Every movement in the ER, the repositioning of patients, the coverage of blind spots, the coordination of staff, was executed with exact timing, almost choreographed. The intruder realized too late that they were facing more than a standard hospital team. Finally, the threat was contained. The intruder was intercepted by SWAT, restrained without further bloodshed. Emily took a deep breath, scanning the room. Every patient was alive. Every staff member was safe. Yet her expression betrayed no satisfaction, no pride. She had performed her duty, nothing more. The ER staff, shaken but functional, looked around at one another. Some glanced at Emily, suddenly aware of her quiet authority, the competence they had overlooked all night. SWAT officers, acknowledging the flawless orchestration, gave subtle nods of respect. But Emily did not seek recognition. She returned to her work, checking monitors, adjusting lines, quietly ensuring the room was secure. The chaos had ended, but the weight of responsibility remained. Emily's authority had been fully revealed, though subtly. She had directed a team of trained officers and hospital staff through a crisis, protected patients, and contained a lethal threat, all without shouting, without drama, without fanfare. As the ER gradually settled into routine, Emily moved between stretchers, observing, adjusting, silently preparing for any lingering issues. The staff whispered among themselves, some in awe, some in quiet regret for having underestimated her. Emily's quiet mastery had turned the tide, but she remained invisible to most. Her work was complete, her authority acknowledged only in hushed gestures and subtle nods. There was no applause, no accolades, just the heavy, earned calm of a job done perfectly under pressure. And as she straightened her uniform and checked one last monitor, she allowed herself a fleeting glance out the ER doors. Outside, sirens faded, the city resumed its rhythm, and the hospital, temporarily at least, was safe. Emily returned to her patients, quietly, efficiently, unseen yet indispensable. The final confrontation had passed, but the weight of her silent authority lingered in every corner of the ER. Silent control. Invisible leadership. Authority fully earned. Emily remained the unspoken anchor of the night. The adrenaline in the ER had begun to fade, leaving behind a heavy, almost tangible exhaustion. Monitors beeped steadily, patients breathed easier, and the sirens outside receded into the distance. The chaos was over, but the weight of the night lingered in every corridor, every stretcher, every pair of eyes that had witnessed danger firsthand. Emily moved slowly through the ER, checking on patients with the same quiet precision she had displayed all night. Every 4-line, oxygen mask, and monitor was in its proper place. Every patient was stable. Her hands moved efficiently, but her movements carried no trace of celebration. She had done what was necessary, nothing more. The SWAT officers lingered near the entrance, subtly acknowledging her without words. One of them nodded briefly, a silent gesture of respect for the calm authority that had guided them through the crisis. Another officer adjusted their gear, glancing at Emily with a mix of astonishment and reluctant admiration. Yet she offered no smile, no comment, no acknowledgement. She was focused on the patients, not the recognition. The ER staff began to recover from shock. A few whispered about how Emily had managed the room, coordinated with SWAT, and kept everyone alive. Some were incredulous, still processing the events. A doctor approached the trauma bay and quietly adjusted a monitor, nodding at Emily with subdued respect. But there was no celebration, no fanfare, just a shared understanding of the magnitude of her actions. A nurse approached to ask about a minor detail, and Emily answered calmly, methodically. Every question, every motion, every instruction was delivered with quiet authority. She did not linger for praise, did not draw attention to herself. She had earned trust through action, not words, and that trust now hung quietly in the room like a steady heartbeat. Outside the ER, the city had resumed its rhythm, oblivious to the near disaster that had unfolded inside. Inside, life had returned to a semblance of normalcy. Patients were stable, staff were attentive but wary, and the SWAT team had returned to their command post. The crisis had passed, yet its lessons remained. Emily checked one last patient before stepping back. Her posture was calm, her gaze steady. She had maintained control without being recognized, had protected lives without being thanked, had executed authority without needing it acknowledged. The staff now saw her differently, though subtly. They had underestimated her for hours, dismissed her abilities, and yet she had orchestrated the ER through danger with an invisible hand. Recognition was not given openly, but it was felt in the quiet glances, the subtle nods, the unspoken acknowledgement of competence. Emily moved to the supply cart, tidying instruments with deliberate care. Her work was done, her authority undisputed, yet unspoken. The ER was calm, orderly, safe, and she remained its unseen anchor. No one would make a scene. No accolades would be announced. The quiet heroism of the night belonged solely to her, and it would remain that way. Quiet mastery. Earned trust. Calm authority maintained. Emily had survived, guided, and protected, but the spotlight never found her. The first light of dawn crept through the high windows of the ER, washing the ward in pale gold. The chaos of the night was gone, replaced by a fragile calm. Patients stirred quietly, nurses moved efficiently, and the monitor's beeps returned to a steady, predictable rhythm. Emily moved among the stretchers one last time, checking vitals, adjusting blankets, ensuring that nothing had been overlooked. Her movements were calm, deliberate, almost invisible. No one spoke to her directly, there was no applause, no recognition. There was no need. She had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. A doctor passed by, offering a small nod. A paramedic shifted a stretcher silently, glancing at her with a quiet understanding. Even the SWAT team, now departing, acknowledged her presence with subtle gestures of respect. Emily returned none of it overtly, her focus entirely on the patients in front of her. She paused near the trauma bay where the critically injured patients had been stabilized. The monitors now displayed steady readings. The room was calm, safe. She took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of reflection. The night had tested her, demanded every ounce of skill, every measure of restraint, every piece of her quiet authority. And she had passed. No one would write stories about her. No headlines would celebrate her actions. The staff who had underestimated her would return to their routines, perhaps a little more aware, a little more respectful, but unaware of the full extent of her competence. Emily would remain a ghost in the ER, her heroism silent, her mastery invisible. She straightened her uniform, adjusted her ID badge, and moved toward the exit. The early morning light cast long shadows across the empty hallways. Outside, the city had begun its day, unaware of the storm that had raged in its hospital hours earlier. Emily stepped through the double doors and paused. A nurse passing by gave a small, uncertain smile. She nodded briefly, acknowledging it, then continued on. There was no need for more. Her work was complete. As she disappeared down the corridor, the ER resumed its quiet rhythm. Monitors beeped, stretchers rolled, conversations resumed in hushed tones. The patients were safe. The staff were functioning. The threat had been contained. And yet, no one knew the full truth. Emily had remained unseen, her authority unspoken, her power restrained. The ER had survived because of her, and she had vanished into the background once again, a quiet force, indispensable but invisible. The night was over. The storm had passed. The ER endured. And Emily remained the silent guardian, unnoticed yet unshakable. Invisible heroism. Subtle mastery. Calm authority. The quiet ending left the story heavy, earned, and complete.